Now we are at a point where we are ready to connect our controller to the chamber. Your thermal chamber's controller may be built into the chamber or installed in a remote cabinet. If your controller is built into the chamber, you don't have to make any connections from the controller to the chamber. If your controller is in a remote cabinet, this video lesson will show you how to make the connections between your remote C4 and your thermal chamber. Let's start by showing you the difference between a built-in controller and a remote controller. A built-in controller is built into the chamber's chassis. There are no cables or connections coming off of the controller. All of the connections are already made inside the chamber. A remote C4 controller has one main cable coming off the back. This cable ends up with up to 4 separate connections on it. I say up to 4 because each of these connections is for a specific function or feature. If your thermal chamber does not have a specific function or feature, your remote controller will not have the connection for it. So don't worry if you don't see 4 connections. In this video, I will discuss all of them, but they may not all apply to you. Let's take a closer look at these 4 connections. A 12-pin AC connection. This is the main connector. All remote C4 controllers will have this connector. This connector carries the AC power for heating, cooling, blowers, controller power, and fail-safes. A 6-pin DC connector. This is the temperature probe connector. All remote C4 controllers will have this connector. This connector carries the sensor information for probe 1, probe 2, and the PFS probe. A 2-pin AC connector. This is another PFS connector. A 4-pin DC connector. This is the TTL connector. If your system used mechanical refrigeration, a cryo boost feature, or required any TTL connectivity, you would use this connection. Now that I've given you an overview of these connections, we are now ready to plug them in. But first, make sure that the power cord from the thermal chamber is unplugged from facility power. First, remove and retain any retention screws in the standoffs of the remote panel. We will use the screws to secure our connections after they're made. Now, connect the 12-pin main connector. This connector is polarized and will only go in one way, the correct way. Secure this connection with retention screws. Connect the 6-pin DC connector. Match the pattern of the plug with the pattern on the jack. Notice the difference in pin spacing to help you match the pattern. There is a larger gap between the pins on one side of the connector. Next, secure this connection with retention screws. Connect the 2-pin AC connector. Again, this connection is polarized and will only go in one way, the correct way. There are no retention screws on this connection. And finally, if you have the 4-pin DC connector, connect it now. This is also polarized and will need to be secured with retention screws. We also recommend when placing the controller cabinet on top of the chamber to ensure the controller cabinet is at least 4 inches behind the opening of the door. While we recommend that you never open the door while not at ambient temperatures, we know that this may not always be the case when other users are using the chamber. Now we've covered how to connect a remote controller to the thermal chamber along with any cables for additional functions or features. In the next lesson, we will cover how to connect a remote computer to the thermal chamber.